And started. Welcome everybody to the IFCO Venceremos Brigade Pastors for Peace crossover episode, in which we're doing a Cuba report back to talk about our recent brigades that came back in July. I'm Angie Langdon. I work for IFCO Pastors for Peace and do the communication coordinating and a little bit of everything else. I'm so glad to see everybody in the room, and we'll see everybody in the Zoom later for the Q&A portion. So I'm just glad they're there, that they're tuning in with everything that's going on right now in the world. I think the right way to start this is to say a chant together, get the vibes going in the room. So I know y'all know this. You ready? Cuba, si. That was weak. They need to hear us downstairs, so, and on the Zoom. So we're going to say it again. Cuba, si. Cuba, si. All right. Y'all have done this before. Just a show of hands. How many people in this room have been to Cuba? Okay. How many people have been to Cuba on a brigade? How many people have been to Cuba multiple times? Okay, all right. So we have an informed audience, panelists. This is a challenge. Come across, tell them what it is about Cuba, why it's important to go on a brigade, why it's important to get involved, and then to come back and organize ourselves to fight against the sanctions, fight against the state sponsors of terrorism list and everything that Cuba is subjected to year after year. We just saw the vote from the UN that went out yesterday. The results were 187 versus 2, which is the U.S. and Israel. And we know that blockade has been denounced by the world for now the last 32 years, since 1992. So with that vote, we know that the world stands with Cuba, and it's our job to make sure that the sanctions end, because we live here in the belly of the beast, and we can apply the pressure to our congressmen, to our governments, and to our institutions to make sure that it's put to an end. With that, I want to introduce our panelists who traveled in July and are part of the Venceremos Brigade, or the IFCO Pastors for Peace Brigade, Friendshipment Caravan Brigade. Friendshipment Caravan. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Make sure that your mic is on.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Oh, it worked. Okay. I'm Shelby. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a teacher in Brooklyn. I teach elementary school. I have been with IFCO on the past 2 caravans, one to the western side of Cuba in Havana and other provinces nearby, and most recently to the eastern side of Cuba. Both times were awesome.
Peace, everybody. All power to the people. My name is Chris Duran. I'm part of the Venceremos Brigade. I've been on the last 2 trips with them. I was on a brigade and a leadership trip this past July, both times in the eastern part of the island, mainly focused in Santiago de Cuba. And I also organized locally in North Jersey, in Essex County and Hudson County. And I'm a teacher in Plainfield, New Jersey. So.
Greetings, my name is Pat Loffman. I've been to Cuba 4 times. I was with the IFCO Brigade this past summer. My first trip was in the mid-90s and was focused in Havana. It was with a jazz group. And then the other 2 times I went with different groups, and then this time I went with IFCO. I am a retired midwife of 41 years, and so I was really interested in Cuban health system, and happy to be here.
Thanks, Pat.
Hello, everyone. My name is Summer Tessera. Any pronoun is fine. I've been to Cuba twice, both times with the Venceremos Brigade. And tonight I will be talking on the Cuban democratic system.
All right, thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. So I think an important part of brigades and going to Cuba is also learning the history that was put into the brigades. Why did they start? What is their focus? I know, so with IFCO, we've been doing brigades to Cuba since 1992, which back in the day, the caravans looked a lot different. They were school buses organized throughout the country that would come through, pick up caravanistas, pick up medical aid, pick up donations, and also do education along the way. And then they would travel all the way down to the border of Mexico and travel without a license, saying love is our license, because you shouldn't have to get a license to do what is the right thing. And thank you. And, a big piece of our history with Cuba is the 1993 caravan, in which one of our buses was seized on the border in a town called Laredo, Texas. The bus was impounded, and the people on the bus, including the founder of IFCO, Lucius Walker, stayed on that bus and declared a hunger strike. They went on that hunger strike, I believe, for 23 days in heat. That was like over 100 degrees, Texas heat. And because they knew at that point in 1993, that's a special period in Cuba in which medicines, food, everything was in severe shortage. And they understood that desperation and the importance of fighting to get through with all of the aid, all of the computers and everything that Cuba needed. So after that, it was like, we're coming, we're going to keep coming until the blockade ends, and we've been coming now for the last 33 years. It's the 33rd Friendship McCaravan, but since 1992. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit about the history of the Venceremos Brigade to either of our panelists.
Is on? Okay. Thank you. So the Venceremos Brigade is the oldest Cuban solidarity organization with the Cuban Revolution in existence. It's been in existence since 1969. All right. All right, no problem.
Is that in relation to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade? Is that not valid?
I'm not sure. In existence currently, I guess in relation to that, it's been the longest organization since 1969. Yeah.
I think they're still in existence. They were
Okay.
in the 30s. I mean, you know who was part of that? Harry Belafonte.
Okay. But yeah, currently we've been functioning since 1969. We're organized around principles of unity, around ending the blockade on Cuba, closing Guantanamo Bay and ending the occupation of land in Cuba, removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorist watch list, and educating American citizens and organizers about the Cuban Revolution. So.
All right, thanks, Christian. I mean, so that's the history, that's the context in which people are coming in with the organizations. And I think it's also important to talk about brigade life. What does it mean to go on a brigade? Why should you travel in a group intentionally and experience that education together communally? Because we know that when people, is this on? Yeah. Okay. You see like a cute flyer like that, and you're like, oh, you have an idea of what it's going to be like to go to Cuba. And then you show up to orientation, or you show up on the island, and you're there with people from all over with different backgrounds, entirely different perceptions of what this is going to be. And it's definitely, in my experience of all the brigades, nothing that I can expect. And every brigade is a little bit different. So if y'all want to share like what surprised you the most, what you enjoyed the most about being on the brigade, and so that people get a sense of what brigade life means.
So this was my 4th trip, and as I tell everybody, this was probably the most memorable trip for me, mainly because my first trip was a cultural one, and was isolated in Havana. And in Havana, you get a lot of the touristy kind of stuff. So you don't really get a sense of any history. And then the next two, I got bits and pieces, but on this brigade, I was really able to put together everything. I got a sense of the history, and all of the other 3 trips, all of a sudden now, it all came together and made sense. And even though I had been on other brigades, this brigade, the camaraderie and the sense of unity, the sense of purpose that everyone had, I think also made the trip very memorable.
I'll go ahead and say something. Is this working? Okay. I think that one of the huge benefits of going with a brigade versus going on your own is that like the whole experience is very intentionally put together for you to learn. So if you're interested in learning more about Cuba, getting involved with organizing, exposing yourself to like geographical histories, the trip is planned for you to be exposed to as much as possible in the time that you're there, and to speak with as many Cubans as possible. Like, I just can't even describe how much we did in 2 weeks. It was like 5 things in one day sometimes, and that was a lot. But at the end of the day, like coming back to the U.S., I'm coming back with that much more. It also puts you in contact with all these other people who have the same either like unifying principles as you, the same reasons for being there, the same desire to kind of like give themselves a deeper political education. And then when you connect with those people on the trip, like you're making these relationships that you're going to bring back here, and you have a base with which to organize from. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it at that.
When you go to Cuba and you are able to experience like aspects of their society, and one of the things that is you're confronted with at all times is how the embargo is limiting just daily operations. And you see so many things, initially, so many things that Cuba does not have. But it's when coming back to the United States and you realize all of the things that we don't have, that they have, and how that imbalance affects just your day-to-day operations here in this country so much. And so, like, oh my God, remind me your name. Shelly, forgive me. What Shelly just said is that, Shelby?
Yeah.
My apologies. What Shelby had just said about, like, going with the brigade, you have so much context, right, as to, like, what it is that you're seeing versus if you're just going as a tourist, where you're going to be just seeing, like, more touristy things. But going with an intentional purpose is profound.
I think also the opportunity to really like get involved and like learn about like the different social structures in Cuba, learning about the medical system, learning about the educational system in Cuba on various levels is also very important. And that's what you get with an organized structure like the brigade, getting the context of how Cuba has also supported like our liberation struggles here within the United States is also important. And we'll probably talk about it later, but like the people that facilitated our trip with the Venceremos Brigade, like ECAP in Cuba, is headed by a former political prisoner here in the United States. And when you think about that in the context of our political prisoners here in the United States who have fought for the freedom of colonized people here in our own context, it really grounds us in, seeing how our struggles are interconnected, seeing how the blockade is unjust, but also seeing how, that same blockade is instituted by a government that also, creates conditions for us here in the United States. And I think the principles that come along with the brigade really ground us in being able to guide our learning about Cuba, as opposed to just going on a tourist trip. So, I mean, I think that also it allows for us to, know how to legally navigate these things, because a lot of people also get in trouble for going to Cuba. Because we know that there are penalties for going to Cuba just for trying to experience, the Cuban Revolution firsthand. And, just being able to be prepared for that is also a benefit of these types of brigades.
Sorry, can I say one more thing? Yes. Something else I thought about too is these brigades, like these two mentioned, have been going on for so many decades, and in that time they have built really strong connections and relationships with organizations in Cuba, families in Cuba, people in various parts of the island. So then when you go, your trip is also being informed by what Cubans have said they want Americans to do, not just you're going and doing what you think might be good, right? So like that long-standing connection is very important too in terms of how we interact when we go there.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that impressed me was we were there for, 2 weeks? And we experienced a lot of what the embargo means for the Cuban people on a daily basis. We experienced that also. And to the extent that Cubans their resolve to succeed they have no intentions of relinquishing their principles and their philosophy and their belief that socialism is the way to go. And so I think that was instructive for me to come back and share my experience with everyone. And I think people are tired of me now talking about Cuba. But I always say to them, the reason the blockade continues is because what the Cubans have cannot be exported outside of Cuba because it would completely destroy the world order. And I think for me, that was what impressed me the most, the resolve of the Cuban people to make certain that the revolution succeeds.
Well, you touched on it. You touched on it a little bit, Patricia. But I was going to say, we talked about the importance of going on a brigade, and I thought maybe if y'all could share, like maybe the most rewarding thing about being on the trip, or like your favorite memory, but also the challenge. Right? 'Cause like I said, these people are coming from all over the country. A lot of people don't know each other. So that has its own challenges, or like you said, experiencing what the blockade is on a daily basis. So if y'all could share your favorite piece or your favorite part of being on a brigade, and then also a challenge, so that people kind of get a sense that it is, a complicated trip.
Without question, the July 26th celebration was just absolutely, for those of you who are not familiar, the July 26th celebration of the attack on the Moncada Brigade. The program was held at the Moncada Brigades. We had to be there. We had to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning because they wanted the celebration to start on time at 5 a.m., which was the time that the attack began. And so we all had to be in our seats by 5 a.m. And the way this program just evolved, I mean, I can't even describe what it was like. All of the individuals who participated in the attack, their pictures were superimposed on the buildings, which was technologically, you think about what the Cubans don't have, and then you look at what they're able to do with what they do have. And it's just amazing. The Cuban people remember everyone. They forget no one who participated in the revolution. I would have to say that that celebration for me was just it.
I'll say my favorite part. I'm still reflecting on the challenges. There were several, but we went to help with construction of a new hospital because some flooding, or I forget the right word for it, like some flooding or something. It had destroyed a hospital that was close to the shore in Bayamo. So we went to kind of like be part of the construction of the new hospital. And there were a ton of people there, men and women, just everyone kind of chipping in. And we were just kind of like chatting with a couple different people. We learned that many of the people there were doctors and nurses who were going to work at the hospital, just kind of like taking their own time to literally help build it, like brick by brick. And this other guy who we were working with for a long time, like we came into it with I came into it with my like US perspective of like, oh, these are all construction workers, right? But literally everyone there turned out to be someone from the town who was taking their time. And there was like a dude who was like an elected official just, building the bricks with everybody else. And I didn't find out until later that he was, the equivalent of like a council person. And if that was happening here, it would be like a press release, it would be a photo shoot, it would be, But that's just what you do, you know, like that's just the culture of it. Is if a hospital needs to be built, we're just gonna go do it. And there was nothing to it. It was like really inspiring to see it in that moment.
I don't know. I think there was a lot of like very like striking moments like in our experiences in Cuba. I think that for me personally, there are like a lot of moments where you really get like that drastic contrast between like what we have here in the United States and what they have in Cuba. You know, even with like the material difference, even with the blockade, like the sense of social solidarity is a lot different in Cuba. The sense of people protecting each other, the sense of people protecting what they have fought for and gained, and the sense of historical continuity between their revolutionaries and their veterans and the youth is something that's very intentional and is something that is intentionally broken apart by the U.S. government here in the United States. Again, when we go back to the political prisoner struggle here in the United States, we are intentionally kept from legacy of you know, revolutionaries that we've had in our own communities. And you know, there in Cuba, there's a very strong sense of respect for the people who have gone to Angola, who have gone to South Africa, Namibia, Nicaragua, whether as teachers, doctors, soldiers, and sometimes a combination of those like different roles, you know, just in service to the people. And I think that basic, you know, principle and that basic, you know, that basis for organizing is very much different than what we have here in the United States, and something that we could, you know, very much model our own organizing off of. And another thing was that when we visited with some doctors at a pediatric hospital, they were often like just amazed by the conditions here in the United States that we described to them when we asked questions about, you know, in the United States here we have, you know, this thing going on with, you know, prisoners, or how mental health is treated. And they couldn't relate to it whatsoever, you know, because for them, the basis of, you know, medical care or even rehabilitation through the criminal justice system is completely different. And I think that, you know, that sort of overhaul of a system is something that we really need to think about in terms of how we treat all these sort of social problems, even in a sense where we have like more material gains because of the fact of exploitation than Cuba. So,
Do you see any connection between what you just said and our push now for Medicare for all here in this country?
I think we're gonna get to that later in the discussion.
Excuse me. The social solidarity that Chris brings up is, like the original question, is a favorite memory. While there are many different places and events that we participated in which like really stand out, my favorite memory and the things that I think about the most when I reflect on my experiences in Cuba is how social solidarity looks and feels in interactions with people, right? There is an observable calmness. There is a observable like peace that people have in their interactions between one another that is profound, right? And that could only come from a society that has invested in rehabilitation in many different ways, right? And rehabilitating their environment, rehabilitating the built physical world around them, rehabilitating their bodies through medical systems, like, and rehabilitating people when they, you know, commit crimes or do whatever. Like, when that is how society is oriented, that allows so much more room and so much more depth for interactions between people. And it is, it's observable. As far as challenges, on this kind of on the same note of the things that I reflect on the most is when I think back to interactions that I have as an American there on the island, in which I am kind of stepping out of the harmony, right, that everyone else clearly is in, right? When I don't make eye contact, or when I, you know, or how I would use money, right, just paying for something, right? And you see how it's very different there, even these small interactions. And so just seeing how the fear that is instilled in me as an American, right, because of the interactions that capitalism forces us to have amongst each other are all based in fear, right? And so that's some of the challenges that I reflect the most on.
Just shut me up if I talk too much, but this was just such a wonderful trip. One of the things I was explaining to one of my friends when I got back that a lot of the brigades, we were received by the Cuban president in one of the college auditoriums. And I said to her, I keep saying to my friends, now, if I wanted to be in an auditorium with Joe Biden, I probably would have to cough up maybe $500,000, and then I'd have to go through Secret Service, make clearance. And clearly here we were in a very, casual setting, interacting with the Cuban president one-on-one, and it was just like the thought that anyone would harm him just never crossed anybody's mind. So again, the respect that there is between the solidarity of not only the people who are in the different brigades, but amongst the Cuban people themselves. I think that's phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I mean, that's a lot. I'm learning as I'm sitting here. I'm like, yeah, you're right. I think when we reflect on all the different things, like you said, Shelby, from morning till late in the day, I mean, it's an all-day affair of running and learning and enjoying and trying to sleep in between. I think when we talk about the visits to the medical institutions, to the schools, to the community gardens, to these different places, it's a lot to try to hold on to and bring back with us. So I just thought it'd be good if y'all could share maybe the most impressive things there is to bring back to the U.S. and try to model here what you learned the most from Cuba. And Patricia, if you want to start, you definitely can. Like about healthcare.
The very first trip that I was on in the 90s, one of the people in our group got sick and was taken to the hospital. So this was like 30 years ago. And she was received by the medical community there. Nobody asked her for her insurance card. They knew she was an American. Nobody asked her for money. They took care of her well, and she came back to us, and we continued the trip. And I said to myself at that point, this is something that I would like to delve into some more. So every time I've gone back, I've tried to learn a lot more about the medical system, especially since I'm in it and I see it from a completely different viewpoint. I don't know if you want me to talk about all of that now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So in Cuba, healthcare is a right. It's actually written into the Constitution, and that's something that I had never conceived of. The fact that in the government says that you have a right to healthcare. And so in Cuba, the way the health system is tiered, it's completely opposite of the way it is here. So in Cuba, the doctors live in the community with you. You don't go to them, they come to you. Most of the healthcare, 80% of the healthcare is centered around the family doctor, which is completely different from the way it is here in the U.S. Here in the U.S., it's centered around specialty care. If you want to go to your internist, it's really hard to find a good family physician or a good internist because they don't make any money. I'm talking about in the U.S. And that's why you have so few family physicians and internists, because they don't make any money. The reason they don't make any money is because they all have hefty medical student loans to pay back. So everybody who graduates from medical school in this country, they go into those disciplines where they're going to make a lot of money so that they can pay off all of their student debt, which is completely the opposite in Cuba, because in Cuba, medical school, all professional education in Cuba is free. If you want to be a teacher, you go to teaching school. If you want to be a nurse, you go to nursing school. If you want to be a doctor, you go to medical school, and you don't pay for anything. So when I talk to people about healthcare in Cuba, they say, well, the first thing they always say to me is, well, how much money do the doctors make? That's the first thing everybody asks me. How much money do they make? And I say, well, the Cuban system says healthcare is a right. They were educated free, and so it's their responsibility to give back, and they do that willingly. So 80% of the healthcare in Cuba is centered around family physicians. And the family physicians live in the community with you, so they know everyone. They know not only the individual who's receiving the health care, but they also know everyone in the family. So a lot of the things that we don't focus on in healthcare, such as, are you living in a home? Do you have the right kinds of foods to eat? All the things that impact your health. Health is impacted by many, many things. We now have fancy words for it. We call it social determinants of health, for those of you who read this kind of stuff. But all social determinants of health is all of these environmental things that impact on your health. So 80% of the healthcare structure is around the family physician. If the family physician, if whatever is wrong with the individual is outside of the scope of the family physician, then you are referred to what's called a polyclinic. And about 15% of individuals are referred to the polyclinic. And if your healthcare still cannot be managed at that particular level, then you are referred to the specialist. And only about 5% of the population end up in specialty care.
50 years ago, we had something like that in this country, 50 years ago.
So, as I said before, in Cuba, no one pays for their education, but not only does Cuba not charge, but they also contribute to educating doctors from around the world. So you have American medical students who go to Cuba. There are actually over 300 physicians working in the United States today who were trained in Cuba. We were received at the hospital, one of the hospitals that we went to. I think I have the name here. Do me a favor. I'm going to ask you just to kind of, thanks. The Carlos Manuel de Cespedes Hospital that was in Holguin, and we were received by the medical director and the medical leadership and the staff. We were also educated by two of the physicians. Well, I think they were graduating. One was from Burkina Faso in Africa, and the other one was from the Comoros Island, which is off the eastern coast of Africa. I don't know if you know where Madagascar is. It's around there. And they shared with us what the impact of the embargo has done to Cuba. So, for example, they are not able to just get some of the basic things that we would go to CVS for. So things like aspirin or ibuprofen. They can't get medicines for people who are diabetics, have high blood pressure, thyroid medicine, things like an EKG machine, anesthetics to perform basic medical tasks, just up-to-date instruments to do diagnostic procedures. And even if the diagnostic procedures could be performed, they don't have the medical instruments to then treat whatever the machinery said that the individuals need. Currently, there is a drive to obtain medicine to raise funds to pay for cancer medicines for children. And so I personally committed to making certain that I contribute, the midwifery community here in New York City contributes something as simple as a fetal Doppler. Those of you who have ever been pregnant, you go for your visit and we listen to the fetal heart. They don't have fetal Dopplers, just to do something as simple as listening to the fetal heart. Or the ability to even just do a sonogram if you want to make certain that the baby's growing well. So, the embargo is really impacting them in a very, very, very direct way. And for me, it's very personal because 5 weeks ago, September 27th, I had surgery on my eye, and that's why my eye looks kind of funny. I had to have an implant inserted into my right eye for glaucoma. So when I'm looking at you through my right eye, it's like there's a film here. But before I could even get my surgery done, I had to buy 2 of these. These cost $80 each. They don't have that in Cuba. Then I had to start with antibiotics before the procedure because they wanted to make sure that I didn't get an infection either during or after the procedure. That costs another $40. By the time, and then of course after the procedure, I had to take 1 drop 6 times a day, a second drop 4 times a day, and a third drop 2 times a day, and I'm still doing that. And so, for someone, if I were in Cuba with glaucoma, which is the #1 cause of blindness, if it's not treated, they can't get this medicine, and they can't get this medicine. Something as simple as these, they can't get. So, in terms of the embargo is really presenting a real problem in terms of just being able to provide basic health care. They have the expertise, but what they cannot get is either medicines or instruments or technology. And even if they could repair some of the machinery that's broken down, they can't get the parts because they don't expect the United States to provide them with the parts, but they have friends around the world, countries around the world, who will provide them with the parts. But the United States has a stranglehold on all of these countries, and they impose sanctions, and they penalize them financially if they do that. So even their friends around the world can't assist them. And when we think of all that Cuba has given to us around the world, it really impresses upon us when we back home here, the need for us to continue to fight. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Patricia, for such a in-depth and powerful statement on healthcare and how Cuba, even though fighting the sanctions and the perils of the blockade, still is able to have a higher life expectancy, have better health outcomes in every category, because Cuba has the political will to put humans first in every decision they make. And I also want to add, because you talked about Cuba trading U.S. students. In Cuba, there is a facility called the Latin American School of Medicine that was started in 1999 and has been training doctors for countries around the world. It hosts students from over 120 different countries, and 10 of those come from the U.S. every year. And that scholarship is facilitated by IFCO. So if you do know anyone who does want to be a Cuban-trained doctor, please send them our way, as the applications are still open. And we are always looking for people who want to be revolutionary doctors. And we are going to do Q&A at the end, but we're going to continue with our panelists.
You reminded me of something. So when you look at, from a very public health viewpoint, when you look at things like life expectancy, the life expectancy in Cuba is higher than in the United States. The maternal mortality rate, the number of women who die as a result of childbirth, that's represented in terms of a rate. And the rate in the United States right now is over 30. In Cuba, it's 4. So when you look at all of the indexes that one would look at to evaluate the health of a country, life expectancy in Cuba is higher. Maternal mortality is lower. Infant mortality is lower, especially, I don't know how many of you saw, an article came out of the Times just 2 days ago about the fact that the infant mortality, which is the number of children who die before their first birthday, has risen again in this country. And of course, everybody's trying to figure out why that has happened. But for all Cuba doesn't have, when you look at these critical areas, they are doing much, much better.
And I think we're going to do
We're going to do a Q&A at the
We're going to do Q&A at the end. And I think what you just said about Cuba's ability to provide for their own people so well, despite having the materials, should be expanded to talk about what Cuba offers the world. Cuba's well known for their internationalism, for the Henry Reeves Brigade, for sending vaccines and doctors to countries, especially in crisis. When there was an earthquake in Nepal, when there was an Ebola outbreak in Africa. And so that internationalism is part of their legacy. And I think, Chris, you had more to add about internationalism in Cuba.
Yeah, I think, I mean, like I touched upon before, like the people who facilitate our trips through the Venceremos Brigade are ECAP, which is the International Community of People's Friendship, and is headed by a former political prisoner here in the United States, who is a representative of Cuba. And, you know, when we talk about Cuban internationalism, we see that, again, through the medical brigades, which has been crucial to many countries, especially through like the pandemic, through COVID. Has been crucial in terms of training many public doctors, public medical systems throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. You know, I don't know, you know, of too many countries in Latin America that isn't very directly impacted by that. And also the history of them supporting materially liberation struggles in Africa and Asia and Latin America, whether it be through education or medical aid or military aid. So when we talk about internationalism, I think that we really have to ground that also in what, you know, we're able to support in a reciprocated way for them, you know, from where we're at in the United States. I think that when we, you know, deal with struggles in terms of anti-imperialism here in the United States, we should, you know, deal with struggles that, you know, well, again, I connect things back to the political prison struggle here in the United States. When we talk about people who were providing community-based solutions here in the United States, and then think about how they were aided by the Cuban Revolution, and think about how they were, you know, people like Asasha Kaur, who was liberated a day ago, back in 1979, who was protected by Cuba. When we think about political prisoners who have materialized internationalism, you know, in, for example, like the anti-Zionist struggle that people are still, you know, that is very relevant today, you know, in Vietnam and, you know, these different contexts back in the 60s, you know, we can think about those same principles as they are today, and we can think about that in terms of that legacy and what we're connecting the Cuban Revolution to in terms of what we hold here in the United States. You know, a lot of us represent different colonized communities. Personally, my father comes from Chile. Cuba supported Chile very materially back when Salvador Allende, the first Marxist president was in South America, was elected back in the 1970s. And including when he was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup, the Cuban Revolution supported guerrillas against the U.S.-backed dictatorship there. And also, you know, my mother is from, she came from back then it was the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And we think about how, you know, that is now a very fascist context backed by the United States. But the Cuban Revolution supported Ukraine even when, you know, the Chernobyl disaster happened, and accepted children into their country to treat them, you know, through their medical programs in Cuba. So in a very material way, like wherever you come from, there is some type of way that the Cuban Revolution has supported that community. And in terms of reciprocating that support, you know, we have tasks to do in terms of, you know, ending the blockade on Cuba, ending the state-sponsored terrorism, you know, designation that the United States places upon them. You know, we have a great responsibility from within the belly of the beast to do things like that. You know, we hold a military base in Cuba. And when we think of occupation and, you know, the way that the United States imposed itself upon the world, and we think about places like Israel, there's no difference from what Israel is and what Guantanamo Bay, the military base, is. That's right. There's no difference. And there's no difference in what that material looks like from any downtown city, you know, in, I mean, at least in a large part of the United States in the Northeast. Downtown Jersey City looks like Guantanamo Bay. Downtown Jersey City or downtown, you know, New York looks like, you know, Israel. And it's a playground for this Western colonial mindset. And so when we come from oppressed communities here in the United States, when we come from communities that are connected to the global South, we have a direct interest in defining what imperialism looks like to us and how to make these sort of big jargony words like imperialism and capitalism, you know, how to break that down into what we see here materially in the United States and who has fought against that. And how that relates to struggles around the world, how that relates to people who have supported our struggles here. And so internationalism is a reciprocal effort, you know, and Cuba has supported us, has supported other countries, has supported other liberation struggles, but we also have to support them in turn. So.
Yeah. I mean, I got the honor to go to the UN for the past 2 days and watch the vote, and country after country gets up and speaks on what Cuba has provided for their countries, not only historically but currently, sending vaccines, sending doctors, sending aid, and basically being on the front lines of any disaster. A few countries called Cuba a beacon for South-to-South cooperation. Right? They're a model of what all countries who are wrecked by imperialism need. Yeah.
I just also wanted to add in the context of countries like Palestine, they have been one of the few countries that have been unequivocally standing with the Palestinian liberation struggle for at least the last, as long as the Cuban Revolution has existed. And currently, when the United States is seeking to militarily invade and occupy Haiti again, they've been one of the few countries in the Caribbean to outright oppose military occupation. And one of the few countries in the world to outright oppose military occupation. And we very much need to stand in solidarity with that demand instead of just, trying to play the whole both sides type of thing, which a lot of people try to do. So,
absolutely. I think, we talk about Cuba and we've talked about the international aspect of Cuba, but I think also one of the major conversation that comes up with people who don't know much about Cuba, or even what's talked about every 4 years, is human rights in Cuba, and this idea that Cuba doesn't have freedom of religion, doesn't have basic standard rights for their people, while here in the U.S. we often struggle with things like not having access to healthcare, education, housing. And so I think one of the models that we should talk about is the Families Code, and how that was adopted in 2022, and what the Family Code is in Cuba, and what it actually means for the Cuban people.
Great. Okay. Yeah. I want to talk about the Family Code. First, I just want to respond to something that Pat said about, because everyone asked me too. They're like, well, how much do doctors make in Cuba? Like, people are always like, blah, blah, blah. And one of the most Cuban things ever is being a doctor. Like, I think when you go, it's the mindset shift that comes with being a part of a community that's based on completely different principles than we have here. And that's what makes it, I'm like, doctors are so cool there, just get over it, like, whatever. But I kind of understand why it's so hard for people to wrap their mind around the fact that it's such a big deal, it's so venerated, it's so, like, special to be a doctor, and it's not about the money, because it's a community that values, like, care and values your neighbors first, where we live in a community that values money first. So, okay, sorry, I just had to say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Cuba's very progressive and impressive family code, because I was in Cuba with IFCO the last 2 summers, and in 2021, they were just gearing up to do a big vote on this new law that determined, it's family law, relationships between people, gender, sexuality, divorce law, all of that is wrapped into this code. And so they were gearing up to do that vote, and then it passed in September of 2022, which was really exciting. And the next time I went back to Cuba, I saw a lot of the same people who were just super excited that it had gone through. So I think something that like makes the code really impressive is, and then I'll go into the details of like highlighting some things that are actually in it, but just like the overwhelmingly democratic process that allowed it to be written and developed, because while there were like researchers in certain disciplines like sociology, law, psychology, whatever it may be, coming together to like draft out the first versions, and they had also like the big national groups like the National Women's Federation, the network of lesbian Cubans, the youth groups, like they had those big groups coming together too. But after that, they put it up to these kind of like public consultations, of which there were 79,000. So like people all over Cuba, over 6 million people were participating in this public process. And when I was talking to people like in September of 2021, they described to me a process of going to like a public computer, and they saw each of the paragraphs or like the sections of the code, and they were able to click yes or no on each one, and then they could write in their own, and they could give reasoning for why they wanted to get rid of any of them. So, and then imagine that happening like in public on computers, and it went through 25 different drafts. It started in 2018, so it went through this process for several years. They took the time to get input from everyone, you know, who was interested in giving input. And I just imagine like for certain laws that, you know, reproductive rights in this country, like if it weren't the Supreme Court justices sitting down to decide this, like imagine if it were all of us deciding it. Like that's what that feels like to me. So I think it's really powerful, kind of just the process itself in how this code came to be. And then it went to a popular referendum at the end of all of that process, where they kind of said, we're going to trust in the people to make this choice at the end of the day. Even after all that drafting and all that public consultation, they're putting that back to a public vote. So I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah, some of the overarching points that you probably have already heard of, like knowing a lot of people in this room, the very educated crowd that we talked about, are, you know, criminalizing discrimination based on gender or sexuality, recognizing marriage as a union between two people and leaving it at that, like no gender specificity, and defining trans healthcare and gender affirming healthcare as a human right, like free of cost, on demand for everyone. But there are also some other details of the code that you might not have heard of, or I feel like just aren't mentioned in a lot of the big headlines and stuff, so I wanted to go into some of that. So for example, like it's the case for many Cuban families that people other than the parents might be partaking in child care for a kid. It's really common here. Raise your hand if you know anyone who their grandparent helped take care of them during their life, or maybe an aunt or uncle, cousin, right? Okay. So it values and recognizes the relationships between other people who might be part of your child's life besides just the parent. And it makes it, every child has a right to communicate with and see their grandparents, their immediate family, and other people who are established as basically like affectionate or important kin to that child. So if a parent falls out of communication with a grandparent, it is still their legal responsibility to maintain the relationship between their children and their parents, which I think is, again, like we don't see that in a lot of countries, that is codified by law. And then that also goes both ways for elderly people, people with disabilities who might have one caretaker in the family. They have the legal right to see their other family members beyond just whoever they're living with or whoever's taking care of them. And that kind of like hit home for me, because I have a great uncle who, like, as he was getting old, his daughter determined that he's like too old to drive, he's too old to do all these other things, and it caused a big fight in our family. And just because he lives with that daughter, she like had the final word on that, and so she has lost communication with the rest of our family, and none of us can see my great uncle. She takes his phone away, whatever. So like this this would make that illegal, right? So, cool. Okay. I also this is my favorite part. So I wanted to just read out, it has this section where it delineates all the parental responsibilities. And I think it's really like, when I was reading this, I was thinking, why don't we have a guideline for what is required or expected of someone just for being a parent or like being the caretaker of a child? So I'm just gonna read these kind of point by point because I think they're like really strong on their own. And it might not be like exact. This is just like my rough translation, and then I'll give some comments, and I guess if you have questions, you can wait to the end. But your responsibilities as a parent by the new family code is to provide emotional stability, help in your child's path to be responsible members of a family and members of society, respect and facilitate the right to communicate with grandparents or other significant relatives, listen to them, and allow them to defend and express their own criteria for and participation in household decisions. Really love that. Instill in them, by example, respect for other people, equality, non-discrimination, and respect for those with disabilities. By example, by leading by example. I think that's great. Teach them about responsible and safe sex. Teach them how to share domestic responsibilities and housework regardless of gender. And then it also introduces the idea of progressive autonomy. So instead of just like drawing a line at 13, you're a teenager, you can do this, and 18, you're an adult, you can do this. It has like a gradual accepting of responsibilities as a child matures that I think is like a lot more true to how we actually go through our lives. But yeah, I just think that the list of parental responsibilities is very powerful because it gives parenthood kind of like the weight it deserves, or whoever's taking care of the child. It says if you're not ready to provide emotional stability, then you're not ready to have a child. And I don't know why it was like so profound, but here we like don't even think about those things. Or anyone who's taking care of our children might not be like explicitly thinking about those things. And then if something happens in your life that like fractures your ability to provide that emotional stability, then you have these other family members who, by the law, can, become kind of that parental role. They call it like affectionate kin. So yeah, and on the other side of all that, of like, the illegal parts of it, I just want to think about like the positive parts of it too, of if we're setting this groundwork for what's expected of a parent, that we're going to show our children how to participate in society, how to treat other people with respect, like as just a starter, like a baseline for parenthood. Like imagine what that does for communities. And again, this isn't like coming out of nowhere. This is reflecting the Cuban community. Like this is written based on a lot of the cultural aspects of Cuban society already. But teaching kids from day one that they're part of something greater and that they can and should participate in the rules that govern their lives, because they're in this household too, and just like giving them that shared responsibility. I, as a third grade teacher, know like how kids flourish when you're bringing them to the decision making and like, what do you think should be your punishment? Like, so yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. I think the Families Code is such a great example of what it means when people are actually writing the laws. Often the people that write our laws were hardly elected by us. And I mean hardly because we're barely going to the polls and gerrymandering. But on top of that, with the Families Code, it was a 67% voter turnout, which is actually quite low in Cuba. That's low, right? If we had 67%, we'd be like, oh, we're doing something right. Cuba was like, we're sorry, because it was in the middle of a hurricane. In the middle of a hurricane, Cuba was still able to show up at the polls, and that's because it was accessible, right? And because they wrote it, right? That, like you said, I think it's 79,000 town halls and meetings and draftings, and they didn't put it to a vote until they believed that people were going to approve of this document. That is such the opposite of what we're subjected to here, where our rights are taken away in the night. Like it leaks out, and then you just have to wait and find out that you're not going to be able to do A, B, or C. So the Families Code is so impressive. Go ahead.
Sorry, one more thing is that the voting age is 16 also. So they, like, the youth that we met in Cuba were extremely educated and also just, like, so excited to participate in it. Because when you can go to the library and start, like, helping write a law or voting on something that concerns you, it's that same piece of, like, participating with your family structure. The kids were so excited. The kids who were 15, they're like, I can't wait. I'm about to be able to vote. I can't wait to go and do it with all my friends, And so it's just like it's a cultural difference too, like a societal difference.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, here it's like, oh, well, there's no one to vote for, And in Cuba, it's like they're having a race to see who can be the first person to the poll, because everything is actually put up, like who went and voted, and so they're out there waiting. And I wish we had that much fun with legislation here. But we can't talk about all of those town halls being organized without talking about the Committees in Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, that really are the backbone of Cuban society, is the mass organization. You really don't understand organizing until you go to Cuba and you see that, material conditions can change through mass organizing, through people sharing what they have and being able to respond because they are prepped and ready and have a plan. And for that, I think Summer's going to talk a little bit more about CDRs and democracy.
Hi, everyone. How fortunate to be able to follow Shelby on such a detailed account of how Cuban people are able to transform their own society and transform their own lives and control their communities. I'm going to be talking about the infrastructure through the CDRs, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which makes up Cuban democracy. Before I explain these things, I want to just give some context that, at least this is the context that makes sense in my process of me trying to understand democracy, the word democracy, in that we come from the United States, where we are bombarded with the word democracy practically daily, right? In that we live in the shining democracy. This is the democracy. We have a democratic structure. We have a democratic election. It's like it's thrown at us all the time that it has no meaning, but we know for a fact that we come from the democratic society with freedom here in the United States. That we know this for a fact, and that anything that does not have our idea of capital D, democracy, is authoritarian and flawed and unrepresentative and couldn't possibly be done where people have control of their lives. So when talking about different forms of democracy that currently exist, these are not ideas that we have to like sit and think, oh, what could be different? Like, this exists on our border, at least in one country, right? We have to embrace the idea that we have no living experience or nothing tangible in our experience in this country here in the U.S. that represents anything close to the word democracy, right? And so when hearing about different forms of democracy or different democratic infrastructure, at least in my experience of me trying to learn these things, it's like, how can that possibly exist? That it's too abstract. It's like, no, that can't possibly work. But this is why we are told that any form of democracy that is not our own is authoritarian, dictatorship, evil regime, right? So as you're familiar, democracy in our country is when you go once every 4 years and you pull a lever that says who's you're going to vote for of the people who you've never met them, you don't know anything about them, you don't know what they stand for, you don't know what positions that they're going to put forward other than everything that's been said in the news. And there's no context about who these people are. There's no relationship, and we didn't have a choice in putting them up, but now we have to all decide one or two, right? And we're told that's democracy. The reality is that we already live in relationships with others. We have friends, we have family, we have coworkers, we have neighbors. There are people around us, right, that we are already in relationship with. What Cuba has done is to institutionalize those relationships, right? And to vote on everything locally, to vote on everything through the committees of defense of the revolution, which are organized in many different ways, but mostly they're done by the neighborhoods you live in, right, for the most part, right? And then collectively across the entire country, these organizations, the CDRs, go and end up making the entire Cuban, or half of the Cuban parliament, right? You do not have to be in the Communist Party to be in the CDRs. In fact, they are separate entirely. The CDRs are straight up just people, right? They're the people in your neighborhood. They're the people that you're around. They're the people that you know. Right, you know these people that you're going to go vote on, so your character is a part of this, right? The relationships and how you are in your society, the social solidarity that exists in the society comes through within like the makeup of the infrastructure. How they were able to have 79,000 small meetings from 2018 until last year, was it?
And yeah, 2021.
2021 is because their society is already organized in this way, right? Going to Cuba and seeing their version of democracy and how their democratic infrastructure is tangibly the mechanism that puts them in control of their lives, right? Tax dollars, money comes into the community, and then through the CDRs, the citizens of the community vote on how that money is going to be used. Is this money going to be put in schools? Is this money going to be put in healthcare? Do we need a stop sign over here? Do we want to expand a community garden? Like, what do we want to do? Do we want this big skyscraper to be built here and take away all the sunshine? Do we want that? Right? We can vote on all of that, right? All the money that comes into the community is people are able to then go and use it. So those are tangible examples, but then intangible examples is the relationships between us, right? Which shall be detailed in explaining how the new family code. So not only are people through the CDRs able to vote on how the shape of their community takes form, but also how the relationships in the community take form, right? They're able to transform their reality by talking to each other. The main difference between Cuban democracy and what we're told is democracy here in the United States is that in Cuba, you have a discussion, right? The discussion is the democracy, right? It is the conversation between people that is how people are able to change their ideas, not by going and choosing one or two on a voter registration once every couple of years, but by continuously talking to people, right? By persuading people, by explaining to people, right? And through that, we're able to see how a Latin American country was able to develop the most progressive legislature in the entire Western Hemisphere, right? To redefine family based on relationship and not on biology is profound. There is nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And that can only come from a society that trusts each other, right? That respects each other, right? When these socialist values that are put forward every day in Cuban society come through in these ways of how they're able to transform their own thinking about gender, about relationships, about sexuality, about everything, through just relying on the mechanisms of trust that they already have by just virtue of being a human being, right? I think that the purpose of going to Cuba on either IFCO or VB or any brigade of going to Cuba is not just to go and experience how profound, this society based on valuing human life over valuing money is. I think that the main benefit and the virtue of going on these brigades is to be inspired enough to come here and want to develop those institutions here domestically in the United States, right? If we are invested and truly believe in transforming our relationships, right, in this country between each other, as we have seen has happened in Cuba, right, then we have to build these democratic institutions here in the United States. Revolutions are not spontaneous events that just happen. They're very well organized, right? And if we want to transform our society in this context, that we need to develop the infrastructure, the social mechanisms, the social institutions, in able to do that, to carry out that democratic and persuasive process, right? And going to Cuba and seeing a living example of how a society can transform itself on a whole range of issues is inspiring and how we need to create those things here. It's not, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to come up with, how do we do it? We can go to Cuba and see how they are doing it. And we can replicate, copy those same institutions here amongst ourselves, right? We don't need the bourgeois capitalist government here, the Democrats and the Republicans. We don't need them to open the door for us to do this. We have to realize that it is possible, and we have to do it ourselves. And through this process of discussion, right? It's through discussion and constant contact, constant communication with each other that transformation like this can only happen. If you're interested in learning how to talk to people in this way, in wanting to organize specifically to build revolutionary democratic institutions here in the United States, feel free to talk to myself afterwards, because it's the only way we're going to do it is one conversation at a time, which is how Cuba was through 79,000 small conversations, 79,000 times, they did it, right? And we see how they have developed the most progressive legislature in this side of the world. So thank you.
Yeah. Summer, you're absolutely right. Organizing is absolutely free. And it's the only way we're going to get free. So get to talking, get to working with each other, get to talking to that stranger, that person you don't like. That's really the challenge of organizing, is that you don't just organize your friends. You are organizing everyone. Because everyone, literally everyone, is organized in Cuba. They are able to do so much, especially when there's emergency situations like COVID, right? In the U.S., there was no structure for that. There's no structure for much, but there was definitely no structure for that, besides denial that it existed. In Cuba, because those blocks are organized, because the CDRs exist, they were able to organize around how to keep everyone home, how to put children through school using the TVs and the televisions, and knowing where the children are and how they can come together for certain classes. When you see hurricanes, right? We saw the flooding, the crazy flooding here in New York. There's no structure for that. I'm from Houston. I was like, don't y'all have flood preparedness? Everybody's like, no. And even in Houston, where we have flood preparedness, we don't have anything because we don't have a structure, right? We have to wait until until your job says it's okay for you to leave, which is often halfway through the flood. So in Cuba, they're able to send buses to the places that are most vulnerable, that are provided by Cuba, by the Cuban government. And because people are organized, they know who should be on that bus and where this bus should go, and they're able to evacuate people to where people don't die during hurricanes in Cuba. I think that's the key to what everyone is saying, is that life is centered around everything that Cuba does, and that organizing is centered around humanity, right? Being able to make sure that this island of 11 million people becomes an island of 12 million people, right? And that we need to preserve life over everything else. I want to give them a round of applause before we go into Q&A. I think y'all did a great job. Hopefully y'all do just as great of a job with the questions that I can see are bubbling up in our audience. I'd like to introduce everyone to Pablo. Pablo will be the mic runner. Pablo came with IFCO this last year, so be gentle with Pablo. He's a kind guy. And so we're gonna take two questions at a time. Make sure that you say your name, speak loudly into the mic so that the people on Zoom can hear you. And we'll take two questions from in the room, and then after that we'll take some questions off of Zoom, and we'll keep going until we don't have any time. Are y'all ready, panelists? All right.
Yes, I'm Raymond from Brooklyn. Boy. Technology. Yes, I'd like to know which walker was on the hunger strike. Was that Lucius or Gail? And did everybody come back well? or
Well,
ill?
Gail is right behind you, so we'll give that one to Gail.
Oh, okay. And did everybody come back well?
Yeah, everybody made it back. We fought and we won the release of that school bus because people like us in the room.
Right.
Yeah, everyone did come back well. And
I'd
they
just like
won.
to point out that if anybody, any young American goes to Cuba, to Elam, they're saving $350,000 on medical school. That's what it would cost here.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So, all those revolutionary doctors, hit up me, Gail, Emily. Raise your hand high if you have a question, because Pablo's going to be the one coming to you.
I'm recalling my first trip to Cuba, which was about 15 years ago or so. And my group met in Cancun. And the group leader, he was from Detroit, he met us in Cancun also. And our flight to Havana we were in a very old plane. And there was smoke coming up from the floor on the way to Havana. And I said to myself, okay, we're not going to make it alive. Okay, the plane's on fire. Anyway, we did make it. And then when we get to the airport in Havana, they're asking us if we want our passport stamped. And, I thought, like, we have a choice, Because they know that because we're from America, from the United States, we're not supposed to be there, right? So we went for a 2-week conference, and Fidel spoke at the conference. And it was just so wonderful, just those whole 2 weeks that we were there. And I remember seeing a sign up on the wall in Spanish, and it said, a better world is possible, and we could make it happen. And so there was another group there at the time that we were there, staying at the hotel, and we were leaving to come back home the next morning, and we had a little party, and the other group was going on to another location. And so we split up when like midnight came, and the other group went back to their hotel. We were staying in a community, residential area, and they were staying down the road a little at another small hotel. And we got word shortly after that group left that one of the women got very sick. She couldn't speak. She was shaking, and so an ambulance was called, and they took her to the hospital, and they treated her immediately. And when she was ready for discharge, they found a family in Havana who took her in while she was waiting for a family member to come and pick her up and take her back to California, And they prepared a report for her doctors here in the country about their diagnosis and their treatment to take with her when she got back to California. She didn't have to pay a penny for that care. And she was a United States citizen, not a Cuban citizen. So I just wanted to say that. I also want to ask you guys, because I've been to Cuba like 4 times, but what was re-entry for you coming back home? Okay, right? Okay.
I always laugh at this because we had been prepared on how to re-enter. So I get to immigration, and the immigration officer says, so what were you doing in Cuba? And I said, I was supporting the Cuban people. And so she said, well, what kind of support did you give them? And I said, I just prayed. And she said, okay.
Yeah.
I can't take credit for this. Someone says going to Cuba is like salvation for the soul, right? And so coming back, it was a real letdown. It was a real letdown.
Yeah, I will say, in the recent years, there have been a lot more detainments when you come back on the brigade. It shouldn't be anything to deter you. If anything, it should make you want to go more. And the detainments have been, like for me, they detained me, and it was just making me sit in a room for an hour or so. But other people did have their phones taken, and definitely had more of an intense, had their luggage gone through. But that's not a majority. And we do prepare our people when they come back with what to expect and what to do when a lawyer's number and everything like that. Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, I was about to say, just going off that, like we do have legal training with these brigades and with these caravans. That's a very important part of it, and that's a big part of it. Actually, going there with the organized group instead of just going there individually, because they have been stepping up harassment of people who have been visiting Cuba, whether it's traveling to there or coming back, and it's largely because of when people resist, when there is a resistance movement, there is repression. And you see that historically. You see that in every example, even, when we try to make that connection with Palestine, like when there is a resistance movement, there is repression in some kind of form. But that's also showing the success of our movement with that. So our biggest thing is just to be prepared for that and be organized with that so that we can support each other through that, counteraction from the state. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ryan, can we take a couple of questions from online? Everybody give a hand for Ryan. He's been doing the tech, setting it up. Yeah, if you're on Zoom, if you could raise your hand, Ryan will let you speak. And what's the question that's in the chat? You can, or you can just say it. I'll repeat it. You can say it and I can repeat it.
No,
I'm gonna
repeat it.
That was a long question. So hopefully I remember it. For those of you who've gone on brigades for multiple years, how have you seen the needs for the Cuban people and resources for medicine and food change over the years? Is there another one online? Okay.
I think one of the things that was undermentioned about the Venceremos Brigade is that we do make a point to bring material aid to Cuba as well. And, we get requests from our friends in Cuba as to what items are needed in that specific context and what we should probably focus on for the next time that we bring a brigade down there. So the items changing very much depends on the context. When it was things like with the pandemic, there was the drive to bring syringes down there. I think comrades spoke on the different needs for medical. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I would say or add that my first brigade back in September of 2021, that's November 15th, as soon as the travel was lifted due to COVID, was very different than the current state in Cuba because of the additional 243 measures added by Trump and the addition of Cuba being put on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which means tons of financial, international financial institutions can't process loans or won't work with Cuba. Those additional restrictions have definitely made things more intense on the island. There's way more fuel shortages and shortages of medicine and food all around. I mean, that being said, people still organize and work together, and everyone is seated with the idea to give what you have, not what you have left over. So they're doing the most that they can, but I would say the conditions are much more dire than they were just a couple of years ago because of those additional restrictions and the enforcement of Title III from the Torricelli Act that was imposed by Bill Clinton. I don't know if there's anything else the panelists have to add. No? Okay, so we'll take two more from in the room. Raise your hand high. And if, Pablo, if you can go to people who haven't asked a question first.
Hello, my name is Larry, and I had been on a tour years ago with pediatricians who went to look at the hospitals and the polyclinics. Nowadays, with the embargo, is there support materially or otherwise from other countries in the South or European countries and so on to circumvent the embargo to the extent that that's possible with enthusiasm and exchanges so that the embargo is lessened to some extent?
Pablo, let's take 2 questions at a time. And then Trevor had a question up here. Trevor, if you could raise your hand. So
I don't want to get too close. Everyone on the panel brought up about how going changed them. From going to Cuba changed everyone. What was the inspiration to go in the first place for everyone on the panel?
that's a great question. Does anybody want to take the first question?
What was the first question?
Is there support for Cuba internationally when it comes to resources?
In terms of, I don't know necessarily know that well, let me just say this. What we learned in Cuba is that even when countries want to support Cuba with material aid, it's very, very difficult for them to do that, to circumvent all the restrictions that are imposed on them in terms of punitive repercussions. I think that this extends for everything. I spoke specifically about medical aid, but I think this extends on everything that Cuba might need, that anyone might want to contribute to them. The financial sanctions and impositions on countries are extensive. So I think it would be it's very difficult to circumvent the embargo.
Yeah, and I'll just add that when we were there, when we were visiting a hospital, we saw a huge machine that had been donated by Italy. And there are ways that Cuba has many allies in the international community. There are ways that other countries or other groups of people or like just organizations are pushing back. When we went to the celebration, the 70th anniversary celebration of the revolution, there were other organizations and groups like us from Belgium, help me out here.
All
Puerto
around,
Rico,
all around.
throughout
Caribbean,
Europe, throughout
Eastern Europe,
all around, who are also
Yeah.
trying to organize to send resources from their countries, regardless of the barriers that may be. But countries are very severely penalized for any of that. And if you send a ship to Cuba from another country, it's not allowed to dock in the United States for I think 6 months before or after or something like that. So it basically makes it impossible financially for a country to send a big shipment to Cuba, because doing their business in the United States as part of that huge trip across the world is the only way that makes it like financially reasonable at all. But there are examples that we saw, like the shipment from Italy.
Yeah, I was going to say the bus that we traveled on from the Venceremos Brigade as a bus donated from China. So I mean that speaks also to like the importance of supporting like South-South cooperation, and the sort of like idea of multipolarity, and just the ability for global South countries to counter Western hegemony in terms of concentration of resource and capital. You know, like was mentioned before, like the United States concentrates all this capital through imperialist exploitation, but also intimidates other countries and companies in other countries from trading with Cuba as well. You know, we have some comrades from places like Belize, and they can't travel straight to Cuba through airlines. They have to go to Miami first, then they have to go to Cuba. So even through that, like the travel, the interaction with Cuba has to go through the United States, and the United States uses the international system to like bully other countries into that. And again, we see other countries and those that specifically have like anti-imperialist line, like Bolivia, Venezuela, Iran, Vietnam, Laos, DPRK, and People's Republic of China. They, you know, donate more items or trade more regularly with Cuba, but even that doesn't necessarily match the blockade. But that is also the need to support that as a principle of anti-imperialism with that. So,
But I think what's interesting that needs to be watched is the discussion amongst BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and now some of the other countries that are joining them about South Africa, yes, about decoupling from using the dollar as the currency around the world. I think that conversation is going to be very interesting to watch for the future.
I agree. Oh my God, so exciting. A whole new world. So both questions I want to give one answer to. So the first one, which my panelists fellow panelists have been speaking on, is international trade, international relations that Cuba has, and to get resources. And then the second question was what noted on the transformational experience of going to the island and why be inspired to go in the first place. If anyone is dedicated to anti-imperialism, if anyone is dedicated to helping anyone in the global south, if anyone is dedicated to helping our own lives here, if anyone is dedicating to any of these things, Palestine, everything going on in the world, right, natural disasters around the world, anything that's happening, then your sight should be put solely on ending U.S. imperialism. And case closed, that's it. And so being inspired around that, and when one is inspired around that, it's then to develop our forces here to be able to dedicate our lives to anti-imperialism, to make sure that U.S. imperialism can end, right? And that we can have democratic institutions that Cuba already has, and we can have a similar society and just develop ourselves the way that we need to here. For instance, the embargo was lifted or adjusted temporarily under Obama, and it had nothing to do with any of the efforts done by the Cuba Solidarity networks here in the United States. It was Latin America banding together and putting their financial weight into it, saying that well, we're not going to trade with you on X, Y, and Z, right? So it wasn't through the ways in which that we're organizing currently that was able to temporarily lift the embargo, right? But to repeat that, if someone is dedicated to helping Cuba or helping anyone in the global south, then our sights have to be on ending U.S. imperialism. And to realistically end U.S. imperialism, we have to realistically fathom how do we build up our forces here in this country to do so.
Yeah, do the rest of y'all want to say what inspired you to come to Cuba in the first place?
Okay, just a testament to how talented Angie is as an organizer. I met Angie, and 3 months later I was in Cuba. She just, she told me about it. She got me interested. She educated me, and here I am 2 years later and organizing, so.
I kind of touched upon where my own family's heritage comes from, but also so when I got into a lot of organizing work, it was directly with political prisoners held in the United States, and my mentors were people who were on the Venceremos Brigade. There are some people here who might know Baba Zaid Muhammad. So I grew up in the greater Newark area, New Jersey. But these are people who were in solidarity with Cuba, in solidarity with international movements for a very long time. My mentor personally was a member of the Black Panther Party from 1968 to 1973 in Newark, New Jersey. And again, my own family's heritage comes from both countries that were destroyed by U.S. imperialism. So it's very easy to make that connection from U.S. imperialism to the local context of what was going on, or what I saw around me. So when people like Baba Zaid encouraged me to go on the Venceremos Brigade to learn about Cuba, once the opportunity came up, once they put out the application and I had the means to, apply, then I just took that chance, and now I'm here. So, and it's very greatly impacted my own personal experience. So. Oh, Nesbitt.
And Patricia, did you want to?
So I've been in health activism since I was a nursing student, and that was back in the early 70s with Young Lords Party. And actually, even though I had been to Cuba 3 times before that, last year I attended a forum at the People's Church with Dolimar and was introduced to IFCO. So it was just about a year ago in April of 2022. And here I am.
We'll do one more round of questions. So maybe we could take 3.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. Can I make a very short comment? My name is Nesbitt Crutchfield. I'm with the Venceremos Brigade. I'm from West Palm Beach, Florida. I'm just here for a week of activity around the UN vote for lifting the blockade against Cuba. I just wanted to say that I'm hoping that everyone here is very impressed by this panel. I know 3 of the people on the panel very, very well. They're like family. And I know the truth that they tell. But you don't know the truth that anyone tells until you've had your own empirical experience. First time I went to Cuba was in 1981. I'm sorry. First time I went was in 1979 on the 11th Brigade. And I was very intimidated because I thought of Cuba as being in another part of the world. And in fact it is. But it's not that way. Geographically, it's 100 miles from the United States. But theoretically and idealistically and humanistically and internationally, it's about 500,000 miles from the United States. But you should go. How many people in here have not been to Cuba? Raise your hand. You're the people I'm talking to. All the other people, I'm not talking to you. But the people who have not been to Cuba, please go. Please go. Go for yourself. As much as I love and believe these people here, go for yourself. Ask your questions to Cubans. See for yourself, and I guarantee you, you'll never be the same. You will never be the same. I've been to Cuba 10 times, and I'm a different person. Thank you.
Thank you, Nesbitt. I think we'll hold on the questions for just a second because that's the perfect moment for everybody to look over to the screen. If you're online, look at your screen. Those QR codes will take you to the websites for the Venceremos Brigade, the Friendship Caravan. Please go on a brigade, get there. And yeah, so if you just want to take a moment to scan it, to save the website, it's worth your time. And bring your friends. It's more fun with your friends because then you have people who can share those experiences. Like they said, one of the hardest things of going to Cuba is coming back. Being back here as soon as you land in Miami or New York, whatever space it is, you're completely surrounded by ads and people who don't look you in the eye. And there's something very isolating about that. And the first thing we do is text each other in the group chat, say, I miss you. I was done with you by the end of the brigade because it's 2 weeks of constantly being with you on a bus and Angie telling you to clap your hands if you can hear her. But I miss you because we're told here that, everyone needs time to themselves to, that they never tell you about social relationships, how important that is to your daily life. And when you're on these brigades, it's one big social relationship constantly. And you'll begin to understand the importance of having someone there with you through the smallest things and the biggest things. But just having someone observe you and be with you is an important part of life that comes out of these brigades. So like Nesbitt said, and I've been on a not on a caravan, but on a brigade, with Nesbitt, great travel guy. Was never tired of Nesbitt. it is a life-changing experience in which these people become a part of your life for the rest of your life. So scan the code. Give me the next question.
Angie, you mentioned that first, the second caravan where they got stopped in a parking lot in Laredo, Texas. And I want to just mention that not only was the group of people on the bus that fasted, but there were a lot of people that came and helped them. There was, including one guy who lived in Arizona, but he came over to Texas and said, "How can I help?" Bill Hill.
Bill Hill is in the back of the room. Bill Hill's been on nearly every caravan for the last 33 years.
I just like to say one thing is that my first trip to Cuba was 1993, and I haven't stopped working for Cuba since. And because of my health now, I've missed a couple of caravans in the last couple of years, but God willing, I'll go again next year.
Yeah.
Yes, my first trip to Cuba was with Witness for Peace. It's like a social organization. And we stayed at one of the churches. We visited one of the churches. Reverend Lucius Walker was there. What I will say about that trip, about the Cuban health situation, one guy didn't listen. You know, they tell you not to drink water, don't have drinks with ice, no salads. This guy apparently had a pre-existing heart condition, and he wasn't feeling well. They rushed him off to the polyclinic, gave him an IV, and he was back in the trip that night. They gave him pills and everything, right? So that was good, you know. But my second trip was like aborted because everybody thought that Trump would close the airports. So anyway, but there's only one bad thing I have to say about Cuba, and it has to do with the airport. Now, I don't know about any other airports, but the Cuban baggage handling system is terrible. I can't stand the way your baggage gets out from the terminal to the person waiting for you outside. That is the only criticism I have, you know. The people were good, you know, everybody was nice, you know.
I will say,
Yeah.
if that's the worst thing, let me tell you, when you go to the airport in Cuba, you can carry your water through security. Why? Because your water is not a bomb, right? You can sometimes keep your shoes on. People are very nice. They're smiling at you, right? When you get there, your baggage may come out wherever it comes out, but the cart is free. And people put the carts back. Why? Because it's a civil society. And you don't have to have $10 to get your baggage. So, ironically, the airport is one of my favorite parts. In which I remember I'm in the land of the free when I land in Cuba, in any airport. But I see you. One more question, if there are any. Oh, we got one in the back.
Hi, I'm Nora. I just had a question and a comment. The question, I'll do that first, is where can we bring supplies that we want to send to Cuba? I have a family member that has been bringing me medical supplies, and I wanted to know where I can bring them. And the second is, I have family in Cuba. It's not very easy to live in Cuba. It's very, very difficult. There's a lot of shortages. And so with that in mind, I think that we should, that's for me, going there, but always coming back here because this is where I live. I want to make Cuba here, and in the sense that I want to create a bubble of sanity and of socialism here. And then I create my bubble here, and then other people hopefully will create their bubbles, and perhaps all these bubbles will come together and we'll create a more humane society. A more humane society.
Yeah. That's a great question about where to bring your medical aid and how to collect it. Many brigades bring medical aid. IFCO, our Friendship Caravan, does bring literal tons of medical aid. I want to connect you with my friend up here, Nefertiti, who is actually a medical aid collecting god. She built a shed in her backyard just to collect medical aid all year long and does a great job keeping track of it. And I think a literal ton came from Nefertiti alone last year. So we can talk about all the different specifications and what is necessary for the medical aid to come to Cuba. The other thing I want to announce before we close is that for the next caravan, we're planning to go in November of 2024. So that means you got a whole year to think about how you're going to organize your money, organize your time, get the get the time off, and how to organize your friends in that last year, and this year coming up, to come with us on the Friendship Caravan. If the Venceremos Brigade wants to give a plug.
We well, first, what a surprise when we got there in July and see Angie and IFCO. Had no idea that we were just a little dazzled, to be honest. I didn't know that we were going to be with people that we knew, and let alone over 100 of them, and that just got off the plane. And anyway, but so it was so great that we got to overlap, right? But the next the Venceremos Brigade is going to have in July 2024, and I believe applications start in April, so there's time before January. Forgive me. January to apply for the July trip will be in January, and so then the trip will be in either June or July. It's all being figured out, but we also just really want to emphasize that don't let cost be a factor. That we will find a way, right? If you want to go to Cuba and you can't afford the fees, then we'll figure it out. Like, don't let feeling like you can't afford it be an obstacle.
Yeah, and if July doesn't work for you, if November doesn't work for you, we got a third option called the Mayday Brigade, which is spearheaded by the National Network on Cuba, and often people from the Venceremos Brigade and the past caravans go to that brigade as well. That's a one-of-a-kind brigade. Not that we're not all one of a kind, in which you stay at a camp with people from all over the world, and you get to share and talk about what Cuba means to all those different countries, and really understand the history of Cuba globally. That brigade, you go to many community gardens and do a lot of work and labor. So that's another thing to think about when you think about your own capacity and abilities. And then you participate in what is usually the largest May Day parade celebration in the world. When I went 2 years ago, it was 5 or 6 million Cubans, so half the island came to one spot, and it was a beautiful scene to see a country that actually celebrates workers. So May Day, Venceremos, the Friendship Caravan, however it is, whenever it is, get there, come back, and join with our organizations in all the work that we do to end the sanctions and end the blockade against Cuba. Just to close us out the way that we started, let's bring the vibes back up, and let's remember to clean up our chairs. All right, ready?
Quick word from Gail.
Gail.
Sorry, just very quickly. This has been wonderful. You all are a fantastic panel. A lot of really good and important information. I want to just, before we end, just embarrass a friend who has come from Cuba, my dear friend Glenda Martinez, who's sitting here right next to me. Glenda is with the Presbyterian Church, is also associated with the Martin Luther King Center and has been here for a few days. So we're honored to have her here. And I promised that I wasn't going to put her on the spot to say anything, but come talk to Glenda. Come free Glenda. So I just wanted to acknowledge our guests. So
Thanks, Gail.
Gracias. Thank you.
You gave me a second to actually go grab our flyers because this year's Friendship Caravan is going to be centered around our new campaign, which is Cuban Kids Count 2, in which we're collecting money to then purchase cancer medication for children in Cuba that can't access that medication because of the blockade. Come talk to me about this flyer. Come talk to me about anything, and let's get you to Cuba. So, together, Cuba sí.
Bloqueo no.
Cuba sí.
Bloqueo no.
Cuba sí.
Bloqueo no.
All right, that's a wrap.
It was really great hearing you talk. Like, for real. Very, like,
You came prepared. You got the notes set.
I was prepared because I was on the Our other person.
Oh, I think we all did.
Mario?